In 1878, the small town of Amherst in Nova Scotia, Canada, was home to some 3,000 people. Described as beautiful by those who visited, being populated with picturesque houses surrounded by beautifully laid out lawns, Amherst was an unlikely candidate for devilry. However, in the summer of that year, it is said that the devil did indeed come to Amherst, and in his rage took possession of a young woman called Esther Cox. The events that would be remembered as the Great Amherst Mystery began on Princess Street in a perfectly ordinary, perfectly charming two-story timber-framed cottage. This was the home of Olive and Daniel Teed and their two young sons, Willie and George. Also living in the house were John Teed, Daniel's brother, and three siblings of Olive, a brother called William Cox, and two unmarried sisters, Jane and Esther. According to reports from the time, they were a tight-knit family and enjoyed spending time in each other's company. Esther, aged 18 and therefore the youngest of the three sisters, was known to watch over her little nephews for her sister Olive. Olive herself is said to have been a thrifty housewife and always kept the home in order. To all who knew them, the Teeds and the Coxes were good and godly people. It was therefore a great shock when, on the 28th of August 1878, Esther returned home in a terrific state of shock. That evening she had been taken out for a carriage ride by Bob McNeil, a handsome young shoemaker who had been courting her. However, far from being an enjoyable outing, their carriage ride turned traumatic when Bob drove Esther away from Amherst and into the woods and attacked her. Pulling a large revolver from his pocket, he instructed the young woman to get out of the carriage and join him on the ground, or else he would shoot her. Esther did not, and she feared that the man she had thought she could trust was about to kill her then and there. Fortunately, the sound of wheels were heard rumbling in the distance before he could do anything. Bob jumped back into the carriage and drove Esther home. Wet through from the rain and trembling with fear, she immediately rushed to bed and was not seen until morning. For the next 4 days, the household saw little of Esther. She was quiet and avoided the house, spending time outside in the streets or in the homes of neighbours. Believing her and Bob to have quarrelled, her family did not question her state of sadness. Not knowing the true story of what had happened, they hoped she would soon recover from her heartache. Every night, they listened to her cry herself to sleep. A week passed since the fateful carriage ride, and Esther was still withdrawn and tearful. It was at this point, however, that things began to change in the house. That night, as Esther and her sister Jane were falling asleep, a sudden noise coming from under the bed startled Esther awake. She claimed that there was a mouse, and so she and Jane searched for the rodent, to no avail. The following evening the same sounds were heard. The two women once again searched under the bed for the mouse that they believed responsible. They pinpointed the rustling to a pasteboard box filled with patchwork, and so dragged it out from under the bed and into the middle of the room. Waiting for the mouse to emerge, the sisters were shocked to see the box jump up into the air by about a foot before falling over onto its side. Cautious, Jane returned the box to its original position, only for it to jump into the air again. This was no mouse, and the young women were now terrified and screamed for their brother-in-law Daniel to come into the room. Irritated at having been forced to leave his bed to dress and come to their aid, he laughed at their story and pushed the box back under the bed. As for Jane and Esther, they were confused by what they had witnessed, but they were certain that they had seen it all the same. After this peculiar but harmless incident, matters in the house quickly escalated. The next night, Esther awoke and complained to her sister that she was feeling unwell. According to a testimony from the time, she screamed at Jane to wake up, shouting, "I'm dying, I'm dying." Jane quickly turned on the lamp and was horrified by what she saw. Esther was standing in the center of the room, her short hair almost standing on end, her face as red as blood. Her eyes looked as if they were about to start from their sockets, and her hands were grasping the back of a chair so tightly that her nails sank into the soft wood. Frightened by her sister's appearance, Jane summoned the rest of the house to help. They tried to guide Esther back to bed. All the while she screamed she was in agony, and then, in a low, choking voice, exclaimed, "I am swelling up, and shall certainly burst. I know I shall." At this point, it is said that the family watched on in horror as Esther's hands and face started to swell. Her skin was reported to have been as hot as fire, and yet she looked as pale as death. Torturous screams continued to pour from the young woman's mouth, and she gnashed her teeth as her entire body swelled to an enormous size. The household did not know what to do, and were by now beside themselves with worry. It was at this point that a loud sound allegedly thundered through the house. Believing the cottage to have been struck by lightning, the family rushed to their feet to investigate. No such lightning was discovered. As Esther's sister Olive raised the curtain to look outside, a second sound was heard. This time, however, it was said to have been so loud that it shook the room. As for Esther, lying on the bed, her body, which had until this point been contorted and swollen, immediately returned to normal, and she instantly fell asleep. This terrifying incident would stay with the family and marked the start of a horrifying series of events that seemed to defy all earthly explanation. Strange noises, knockings, bangings, and rustlings were reported as being heard all over the house, and 4 nights after Esther's swelling incident, the young woman is said to have suffered another similar attack. Her body once again swelled to enormous proportions, only this time when she lay down in bed, all the bed clothing flew off and landed in the far corner of the room. It was as if invisible hands had snatched at the bedding. When Olive tried to return them to her sister, they were ripped from the bed a second time, and then a pillow was torn from under Esther's head and thrown into the face of John Teed. Terrified, he immediately rushed from the room, leaving the others to sit on the edge of Esther's bed, which was the only way to keep the bedding in place. The panic continued for a couple of minutes more before suddenly stopping. The same as the previous night, a loud bang was heard, shaking the room, and Esther returned to normal. The following day, a doctor was called to the house. Determined to witness Esther's illness firsthand, and therefore reveal its cause, he arrived in the evening, just as Esther had gone to bed. He performed an assessment and stated that the young woman was simply suffering from nervous excitement, triggered by having experienced a recent shock, and that there was nothing untoward happening in the house. Just as he said this, however, it is claimed that the pillow beneath Esther's head moved. It was pulled out from under her, only, unlike the previous time, the unseen hands which grabbed it also seemed to put it back, straightening the pillow out and returning it to under Esther's head. The doctor was amazed. When the pillow moved again, John Teed went to grab it. Grasping it with both hands, he held onto it with all of his strength. It was, though, no use. Whatever force held the other end of the pillow was stronger than the man. As it was pulled away from him, his hair is reported as having stood on end. What followed were banging and rustling sounds as experienced before. Once again, the bedclothes were torn from the bed, all in view of the doctor. Most terrifying, however, was the sound of a person writing on the wall with a sharp instrument. Everyone looked to the wall near the head of the bed. It is said that there, scratched into the plaster in large letters, were the words, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." What happened next was pure horror. A large piece of plaster is said to have flown from the wall, turning mid-flight to land at the doctor's feet. More sounds were heard, loud and incessant noises and distinct knocking, as if made by invisible sledgehammers. The poundings increased and shook the room with a tremendous force. All the while Esther lay in her bed, frightened to death, not knowing what was happening to her. This terrifying scene is reported as having continued for 2 hours, before everything fell to silence and Esther to sleep. In all of this, the doctor was speechless. He could offer no explanation for what he had witnessed, but said that he would return tomorrow to give Esther something to calm her nerves. The following evening, he gave the young woman powerful sedatives, hoping that they would stop the happenings. They did not. When the banging came, it was louder and more violent than ever before. The doctor was even able to hear the sounds from outside of the house, standing some 200 yards away. According to reports from the time, it sounded as if someone was on the roof with a heavy sledgehammer, pounding away and trying to break through the shingles. Looking up at the roof in the moonlight revealed that this was not so. There was no one on the roof, and no apparent cause of the sound. As loud as the banging was, it soon became known throughout Amherst that something strange was happening at Daniel and Olive Teed's cottage. Not only that, the manifestations were no longer confined to the night time, but could be heard at all hours of the day. The phenomena continued for weeks, with the doctor returning night after night in an attempt to offer Esther some relief. As the events continued, the family came to ascribe the sounds to an external and conscious entity. It could hear them, they claimed, and even had the ability to respond to their questions. On one occasion, when Daniel asked how many people were in the room, 5 distinct knocks were allegedly heard. At the time, there were indeed 5 people in the room, with Esther supposedly unable to see who attended her bedside and therefore falsify the knockings, her face being buried in a pillow, trembling with fear at the time. Whatever the cause of the happenings, as the weeks progressed, one thing was clear: they were entirely connected to Esther. They only occurred when she was in the house and would stop altogether whenever she was absent. If there was an entity present, it was attached to her. By now, Esther had told her family about the incident with Bob McNeil, and it was agreed that it had somehow been the cause of the phenomena. As the case increased in fame, respectable witnesses, including Dr. Edwin Clay, a well-known Baptist clergyman, visited the house on Princess Street in order to try to explain the happenings. Clay, like the medical doctor who attended Esther, was able to experience the knockings and mysterious writing on the wall firsthand, and left fully satisfied that Esther did not produce any of the manifestations herself, and that her family did not assist her as some people believed. He did instead propose an alternative theory, that on the night of the carriage ride, the shock that Esther had experienced led her to becoming, in some mysterious manner, an electric battery. His peculiar theory suggested that invisible flashes of lightning left her person, and that the knocks heard in the house were minute claps of thunder caused by her electricity. As unlikely as the theory sounds, his lectures on the subject drew large audiences, and Clay continued to defend Esther and her manifestations as genuine phenomena. Other theories were also put forward, with some in the town adamant that Esther was a fraud and was purposefully falsifying the happenings in order to gain attention. This the family disputed, and, eager to keep their privacy, were forced to call the police to their home on several occasions so as to disperse the large crowds that gathered outside, anxious to get in and witness Esther's manifestations for themselves. Some even whispered that Esther had the power to mesmerize others and force them to see and hear things that were not there. And so, in pursuit of a terrestrial explanation for the happenings, a supernatural cause was proposed. For most, however, the answer was clear. The phenomena was not the work of man or woman, but the actions of an unnatural being. This belief was all the more accepted when, one night whilst in bed with her sister Jane, in a different room in the house, Esther whispered that she could hear a voice speaking to her. Supposedly, this voice told her that it had once lived on the earth, but had been dead for some years. Chillingly, the voice also told her that it would set fire to the house that very night, as such was its power. Jane called the household, including the medical doctor, to the room. As they debated what Esther told them, a lighted match is said to have manifested and fallen from the ceiling to the bed. The fire was extinguished, but during the next 10 minutes, at least 8 more matches were seen falling onto the bed and about the room. All were extinguished before any harm could be done. Proceeding to engage the entity in conversation by means of knocking, Daniel asked if the house would be set on fire. 3 knocks signalled an affirmative answer, and 5 minutes later a fire did indeed break out in the house. It is said that a dress belonging to Esther that had been hanging on a nail in the wall near the door was removed, rolled up and thrown under the bed. Before the family was able to retrieve it, the fabric burst into flame. Luckily, the fire was extinguished before it spread. However, this incident had proven the evil nature of the being to the household once and for all. According to Esther's sister Olive, nothing but the devil or a ghost with evil designs could do so terrible a thing as to start a fire in a cottage at the dead of night. And indeed, the family were right to fear the so-called devilish ghost. 3 days later, smoke was seen coming up from the cellar of the house when Esther and Olive were washing dishes together in the kitchen. When Olive rushed downstairs to investigate, she discovered a barrel of shavings blazing almost to the floor above. The two women were forced to rush out onto the street and call for help. The neighbours were all roused, as was a passing stranger, a gentleman who had not been seen before in the town. He is said to have thrown off his coat and rushed into the cottage, where he was quickly able to extinguish the fire. He left immediately afterwards, not waiting to be thanked. A strange side note to this incident is that nobody knew who the man was or where he came from. After the fire, he was never seen again. By now, opinion was firmly divided. There were those who believed in the invisible power of the ghost, and there were those who ascribed the entire case to Esther and her mischief. The fire marshals were of the opinion that Esther had set both fires herself, and another in the town cruelly suggested that a good rawhide whip across her back would soon stop the manifestations. As for her family, they were in no doubt as to the genuineness of the happenings. However, the fires had been too much for them to stomach. Esther herself expressed that she could not remain in the house, for the ghost had shown her an image of a fire in the loft under the roof, which would burn them all to death. And so, not wanting to see their home burn to the ground, and fearing for the safety of their young sons, Olive and Daniel asked Esther to leave. Daniel is recorded as having said to his sister-in-law, "I don't turn you out. It is the devil of a ghost who drives you from your home." Fortunately, another in Amherst was able to offer Esther shelter, and so in January 1879, a kindly local restaurant owner called John White took her in. For 3 weeks, things seemed to have returned to normal, but then, as if with a fury, the happenings returned. Now, physical objects disappeared before people's eyes, only to reappear elsewhere in the room. On one occasion, a scrubbing brush is said to have disappeared from Esther's hands, before falling from the ceiling a short time later, hitting the young woman on the head as it fell to the floor. Furniture was also allegedly thrown about violently in John White's dining saloon, and doors were lifted off their hinges. It is even said that one time a large box, weighing 50 pounds, was moved a distance of 15 feet in broad daylight without the slightest visible cause. All the while, miserable Esther was at the mercy of the invisible entity, supposedly being slapped, scratched and pricked by unseen hands. One time, it is claimed that she was even stabbed in the back with a clasp knife. The knife is said to have been stuck into her back, at which point John White's son Fred pulled the blade from the wound and put it away into his pocket. Terrifyingly, the ghost supposedly removed it again from his pocket and in a second struck the woman once more, pushing the knife back into the original wound. As news of the case continued to spread, researchers approached Esther wishing to study her. She consented and even embarked on a speaking tour with Walter Hubble, an actor and writer with an interest in psychic phenomena. It is thanks to his record keeping that we now know so much about Esther's case. For a time, audiences paid to hear her story, with men of science from all across Canada and the United States verifying personal observance of strange happenings. Ultimately, however, Esther's claims proved to be too controversial, with a riot breaking out at one of her events. Esther eventually returned to Amherst. Fires followed in her wake, the work she claimed of the entity that continued to haunt her. After the barn of her employer burnt down, she was convicted of arson and spent a month in jail. People's patience, it seemed, had run out. Over the next few years, the phenomena gradually ebbed away, the reason for their original appearance and subsequent disappearance a mystery. Esther went on to marry twice, moving to Brockton, Massachusetts with her second husband, where she died aged 52 on the 8th of November 1912. To this day, the case of Esther Cox and the Great Amherst Mystery remains an enigma. Was Esther a conduit for strange electrical energy, as suggested by Dr. Clay? Or was she the victim of demonic possession after being left emotionally vulnerable by Bob McNeil's attack? Or was it all a hoax? Understudied by modern eyes, the Great Amherst Mystery may well be one of the most well-documented cases of poltergeist or possession phenomena in history. Despite being controversial to some, it is regarded as a true case of the paranormal by many others. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like more of the paranormal, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you also to our members both here on YouTube and on Patreon for all the support you show our work. It is much appreciated. If you would like to become a member and access commercial-free content, including our 2-hour documentary In Search of the Dead, you can do so by clicking the join button or by visiting Patreon. Thank you again for watching. Until next time.